My name is Greg Palast. I'm the principal investigator with the Palast Investigative Fund. You know me as an investigative reporter. You can tell by the hat. And we are sending today to the Attorney General and the Board of Elections our report, the Palast Investigative Fund experts, that was transmitted to Black Voters Matter Fund. This is very, very much a Jim Crow purge. In fact, for those of you who are statisticians, as I used to teach statistics, there's what's called a 0.62 correlation, positive correlation coefficient between race and being wrongly identified for this potential purge. In other words, it's a very fancy Jim Crow operation. So now let me introduce Cliff Albright, a man who holds 2 master's degrees. Doesn't that make you feel bad? 2 master's degrees, and also co-founder of Black Voters Matter Fund. Cliff Albright.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for you and your team, the Investigative Fund, for the incredible work that you've done on this. You know, what we're seeing now, and you referred to it, is Jim Crow voter suppression, right? Even though Eisenberg and Will and the other right-wing conservatives that are behind this effort are acting like they're not aware of that information that you just put up on the screen, that they're not aware of the racial demographics, what we know is that they're very aware. What we know is that this is part of a track record, whereas the North Carolina court said, where they're attacking with surgical precision, disenfranchising and suppressing Black voters. They know exactly who they're targeting us to. This is part of an attack on our democracy. This is a part of a desperate attempt by people who know that they don't have the majority. That's what people who cheat because they know that they can't win. And that's the situation that we're in right now. They know that they are losing. They know that they don't have right and justice on their side. And so they're resorting to these desperate attempts. The other piece, though, that I think it's important for us to raise is, because we say it all the time, we're in battles like this, litigation around issues like this in several states right now. We just did, along with Greg's team, a similar press conference talking about the purges in Georgia, where 200,000 voters were found to have been purged illegally by the Secretary of State there. And so we're used to this. But the issue that we run into is that there have got to be consequences when people suppress the votes, whether it's by official state action or whether it's by actions like groups like Will that are non-state actors, but that are bringing these types of litigation. There have got to be consequences. They can't continue to get away with not having the answer for the fact that we know that it's voter suppression. Because the fact of the matter is this: if they know that these addresses are wrong, that they were using sources that weren't verified, that aren't official licensees of the Postal Service, then guess what? They've committed a crime. Not only have they committed voter suppression, they've committed fraud, they've wasted public resources. And so these are crimes that they are committing. Just the attempt to purge voters when you know that you are using fraudulent and faulty information, that is a crime. And so we need to, and we will be looking into what actions can be taken against the people that are behind these efforts. They can no longer engage in this type of suppression and think that they'll be able to either get away with it and get the suppression, or even if they don't get away with it, that there's no consequences. We've got to really let them know that there are consequences for them attacking our votes. The same way people that make false 911 calls, knowing that there's no threat and knowing that they're putting people's lives at risk, people that make, this is the equivalent of a false 911 call that is attacking our democracy. And just like those people that make those false 911 calls need to face consequences, people that are pursuing this type of voter suppression, this type of frivolous litigation, these types of attacks on voters and democracy, they need to face consequences as well. And we thank you, Greg, for your team for uncovering this data.
Now, let me introduce very quickly LaTosha Brown. You may know her as a incredibly brilliant gospel and jazz singer. She's also, though, a teaching fellow at Harvard University, and most important, the other co-founder of Black Voters Matter. Thank you, LaTosha. Go ahead.
Thank you, Greg, for having me. I'll just ditto all that Cliff said. I think it's really important for us also to recognize we're on the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. This is precisely the kind of egregious behavior that led for the voting rights movement that called for that act. You know, in 2013, when we saw the stripping of the act from the Holder versus the Shelby versus Holder case, those of us that were voter advocates, we actually traveled to DC and sat in the Supreme Court because we knew that we would see this kind of wide scale voter suppression happening. And sure enough, we're on 2020 and we're dealing with some of the same egregious behavior that we saw that brought about the Voting Rights Act in the first place. So when you're talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands, even if you're looking at the number of 129,000 people, that is a medium-sized city in any state in America. That is a tremendous, that's an enormous amount of people that can make the difference in an election. But aside from that, voting itself is not a partisan issue. Voting is a civil rights issue. That is a issue that literally the citizens of this country, if there were Republicans or libertarians, I would be as adamant about their votes being marginalized. Fundamentally, as citizens of this country, it is our right to be able to participate. And so we've got to see this at the seriousness, and it's not isolated. While we're seeing these, uncovering these incidents in Georgia and Wisconsin and others, it is wide scale. We see this across the board. We get phone calls daily from organizations and people in North Carolina and others. And I think the last point that I'll say that in addition to this, I think voter suppression, there's a spectrum of voter suppression. There's one, this egregious act where we're talking about the dropping of voting rolls, but there's also this culture of fear and confusion. And so now you place the burden. What we're seeing is once you drop them from the voting rolls illegally and unjustly, now you're putting the burden on them to go back and register their votes. So that we've got to really see the seriousness that the biggest threat to democracy right now in this country is voter suppression.
Okay, thank you very much, Latasha Brown. A couple things. I do note that Jeannie Meirer has joined us, and she is the national attorney for the Palast Investigative Fund. And we have, again, experts John Lenzer, Mark Swedland, with us. Just very quickly, in a couple sentences, what we did, because I know that you've all read the 5,000-word technical report that we issued, Wisconsin voter purge list errors. It's very simple. And we just issued, by the way, this is our second report of a series. Our first was issued by the ACLU of Georgia, where we uncovered 198,000 voters wrongly purged, again, on this gimmick of saying that they moved when they didn't. And I would like to say that Black Voters Matter is on the verge of sending out 98,000 postcards, big, colorful ones, to make sure that people know they have to re-register because they don't know they've been purged. Now, here's what we did, something very simple. You have a so-called movers list that was put forward by Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty in a lawsuit saying these people under Wisconsin law, these voters, now 129,000 voters, must be removed because, well, they've moved. And again, if you don't live in Milwaukee, you shouldn't vote in Milwaukee. It's against the law. I asked a simple question. Did the movers move? And I asked, who are the top experts in the United States? And the answer is we begin with the post office. And we did hire the chief licensee of the post office, which, by the way, must be consulted. The licensee, Merkeling, must be consulted under the National Voter Registration Act. Now, you could say that may or may not apply to Wisconsin, but it sure makes a hell of a lot of sense to use to first talk to the post office. Second, this was arranged and their work analyzed by John Lenzer, Mark Swedland, and Computech, another company. We had the top guys, and I was told that there are people who spend their days figuring out exactly where you are at 2 p.m. on Thursday, and using 240 databases, over 1,700 data points. So we know, versus the kind of cockamamie, rump, untested, and now tested and shown to be wrong list that Will would try to put together. By the way, we've talked to Eric. The Eric list is not a purge list at all and shouldn't be used that way. So read the report, ask the questions, and most important, as you saw, we have an exact match, a frightening match between people wrongly identified as moving and the Black community. And, you know, to put it simply, the blacker your district, the more likely you are to be wrongly identified as having moved. A lot of that has to do with the use of, you know, sending out postcards which aren't returned. Because, by the way, only about less than 2% of cards were returned, and it didn't matter whether people moved or not. It just looks like junk mail. That's how we were losing people's votes. So if you have questions, John Lenzer, do you have our chief expert, do you have any comments to add?
All right. What we did is exactly what we do for commercial mailers. If you receive a catalog in your mailbox or even a postcard is probably costs the mailer 50 cents a piece to put a postcard in your mailbox, but a catalog can cost anywhere from $1, $2, $3 to put in a person's mailbox. So our clients want to make sure that those pieces of mail go in the correct mailbox, that their customers still live where they live, that their prospects still live where they live. And so a whole industry has been created to make sure that we can identify where people live and where people have moved to. And, first, the post office has a vested interest in making sure that people that have moved have a corrected address. And so they created a file called the National Change of Address File. On top of that, however, there are firms, several firms that have created a whole business out of correcting addresses and making sure they're correct. And as Greg indicated, the particular vendor that we used was Merkle. They're one of approximately 20 licensees of the post office that do NCOA work, but they also do advanced hygiene. And they've created a database that has almost 240 different data feeds into it, constantly coming in week after week after week, so that when they start seeing people's addresses changing from magazine subscriptions to mortgages, one thing or another, they will change the person's address. They know, even if a person hasn't registered with the post office, they have a pretty good idea of whether a person has moved or whether they're still living there. If they're receiving all their billings at a particular address, they probably live there. So we sent this address to them to make sure that we could correct the addresses. And as Greg said, it came back with 39,000 people that we were relatively certain lived exactly where they had registered, and that's approximately 26% of the file that we sent them. But another 58% had moved, but they moved within their county. They didn't move out of the county. So in many cases, they're still eligible to vote, even though they changed residence within the county. And that was close to 38% of the file. So the file, the purge list was highly inaccurate. Many of these people, the majority of them still live in an area where they could have voted and don't deserve to be removed from the voter rolls if that's the reason that it's presumed that they moved.
Thank you, John. Any questions now from our distinguished journalistic colleagues?
What can we do?
Well, I'm going to have Latasha and Jeannie answer what we do. Jeannie Meyer, who is our attorney, who's communicated our reports now to the election board and the attorney general, which are defending the state's decision not to use what they understood to be a flawed list, but is obviously far more flawed than we could have imagined when we actually went through name by name. The state did some sampling and said it's just too dangerous. Even if we're just removing 7% wrong, the list is wrong. That's thousands of people. So this will be communicated to the state to make sure that they do not remove these people, and obviously it may be used in the arguments in the court. Our job as journalists, as my job as journalists, is to get you the facts. Now, yes, until this year, the Palast Investigative Fund, which is a 501c3 nonpartisan not-for-profit organization, funds work for this type of investigation. We've been on the racial voter purge hunt for 20 years, and usually it's my byline in The Guardian, Rolling Stone, BBC Television, Nation Magazine, and others. But this time we were asked by the ACLU and now Black Voters Matter to put this material forward because it's just so important that people also know this and get re-registered now in Wisconsin. You don't have to re-register. So you know my background. What can be done? I will leave that, legally. First, maybe Jeannie Meyer could say what steps we're taking, and then I would like to hear from Latasha and Cliff on the actions that should be taken by people. And by the way, go to SaveMyVote2020.org or gregpalast.com, and you can see if you are on this potential purge list. By the way, we found that some people have already been purged for some reason. Maybe they're picked up by another list. So I ask everyone to check your registration today. Jeannie?
Yes, the court is going to hear the arguments tomorrow. Now, whether or not this report will get in front of them, it is in the hands of the Attorney General who's doing the argument, and I have made sure that that has happened. There is no right for the court to allow an inaccurate list to go forward. That there is no, while the National Voter Registration Act requires states to make sure their rolls are current and accurate, there is it would be illegal once they know that the list is inaccurate to go forward and with a purge that would make the list inaccurate once they know it. And that is the message that I've tried to convey. The second thing is the law says that they can't issue a postcard until they have reliable information that the person has moved. They have assumed the ERIC list is reliable information. Greg's work and the work of the Palast Investigation Fund and the works of Black Voters Matter shows that it is not a reliable list to trigger a postcard. So both of those things are arguments that I think should be made to the court tomorrow, and I hope that they listen.
Thank you.
So there's a couple of things I just want to share. One, in terms of the work, being a daughter of the Deep South and the work that we've done in Deep South, first we've got to acknowledge that the law has always been relative when it comes to Black people. Right. That fundamentally we have ultimately there's always been a fight and a need to fight for those very things that should be guaranteed to us for there to be an enactment to hold people accountable, as Cliff said. And so once again, we find ourselves that we have to fight for what is supposed to be a basic right that is guaranteed to us in the Constitution. And that is really indicative of how structural racism and that voter suppression has been such a tactic to marginalize Black voting power. And so there's a number of things that we have to do. While we have to fight for advocacy, we have to actually fight in the courts. We also know that we're in an era that the courts are being highly politicized, that there is a partisan issue that in many ways the president of this country has been using the court system, even right now on the eve of saying that he's getting ready to elect a Supreme Court justice, that in fact he's seeing that and he's using it, politicizing it to become another partisan arm for their agenda, to push their agenda. And so in that, while there has to be some level that we're seeking remedy from the courts, what we think is where the power really is not the court system, not the legislative branch, but it's going to be people. And so we've got to get people engaged in that, because I can talk about Brown versus the Board of Education was 1954. Most schools did not get desegregated until 1970s, and that's because folks demanded that to be so, not just the court system in itself. So I think that there's one element that we got to actually fight these folks in these courts. Even the Wisconsin court, when we look at the court, that's primarily a Republican court, right? A Republican court, and there's a question of where that court will stand in alignment with the law, right? Or will they make a decision that we know will be rooted in being politicized and partisanship opposed to the Constitution of this country? I think the second and the last thing that I'll say kind of related to that is what we have to do. I think the media plays a vital role. That fundamentally what winds up happening, there are many of us that are saying this on the ground, doing the work to educate people, but we also have to show where this is not, and I think Greg has been doing this for years, that oftentimes in the media, the way this conversation is handled is like these isolated incidents. Like there's, it's the same way that we deal with racism in this country. We deal with racism as if there's just like one or two bad cops that are bad actors without dealing with the structural racism within police enforcement. It is the same thing within the political and the voting process, that it is an egregious, it's across the board, it is a concerted effort by a group of bad actors that seek to undermine and democracy. So I just would say that even for those of you that are on here, we need you to amplify, not just this is an issue that's happening, but then the last and the final thing is that amplify that there are groups like ours and others that are literally fighting Greg, the investigative Greg Palast, that are fighting against this. We're challenging them in court. We're educating people on the ground, and we're mobilizing voters to hold folks accountable who've been bad actors.
It's very clear that none of the laws that are in this country that have result are progressive, have happened because of the goodness of anybody's heart. It's because of struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, it never will. And as a result, I unite with our friends from Black Voters Matter, because it's absolutely clear that it's going to be the people who push these institutions to respond.
Officials around the country say that at this point, that some 30 days before the election, putting more distrust into the system might have a negative effect on turnout. So is that something you're concerned about and trying to counteract as we're a little more than 30 days out?
Let me just jump on this one quick, which is we saw, and Latasha Brown and Cliff Albright, who are in Georgia. That's where we first did our investigation. As I said, 2 weeks ago, we issued the report for the ACLU. In 2018, Stacey Abrams made a big point that voters were being wrongly removed from the voter rolls and fought to get them re-registered. Our investigation for Salon at that, and following up from Rolling Stone and Al Jazeera at that time, we found hundreds of thousands of wrongly purged voters, and what that did was activate people to vote. I don't care whether you vote Republican or Democrat, but you shouldn't be denied the right, if you're a citizen, to vote. Remember, everyone on a voter roll is a citizen of America, and they should not be easily removed. But what you're saying, yeah, to say that, to bring up vote suppression, to bring up people, say people have been wrongly removed, no, it doesn't discourage people. What we found is that it activated people. In Georgia, in Atlanta, I saw signs out, this precinct voted 100%. And you had a turnout that was massive, in part because Stacey Abrams made the issue of illegal purging of voters primary to her election campaign. I'm not saying whether you should be for or against Stacey Abrams, but it certainly didn't discourage voters. They came out by droves, but of course, a lot of them were purged. So that's why I agreed. Normally I use, again, media outlets, but in this case, I have responded to requests from ACLU and Black Voters Matter Fund, because they want the word out when it counts, when people can re-register and do something and save their vote. So no, I don't believe that telling the truth discourages voting. It activates people to take care of their vote. And I want to remind you that in Wisconsin, you can register same day, not easily. You have to have the right ID, which is not, most student IDs don't work, and proof of address and other documentation, and bring a couple lawyers with you. Latasha, do you think that telling, and Cliff, do you think that exposing the fact of illegal purges in Georgia, now Wisconsin, and other states discourages people from voting? We should be silent?
No, we should definitely not be silent. In fact, what I was going to say is everybody already knows that there's some level of this going on. They know that there's voter suppression taking place. In fact, one of the things that we often run into as we're talking to voters, those that don't vote regularly, is that this feeling that this is happening, right? And so that's already out there. The only thing that discourages the outcomes is when we're acting like that doesn't exist. When we expose it, though, when we're honest about it, we expose it. And then most importantly, when we then tell people that you have the power to do something about it, that it exists, that they're trying to purge us, but guess what? We can check our registration and fight it. We can send out postcards. We can spread the word to 5 friends. We can hold these people accountable. When you shed light on the suppression that's taking place and letting people know that they have power to do something about it, that's when the exact opposite happens. That's when what Greg was just talking about happens. That's when you have people who are willing to wait on 6-hour lines the way that we saw it happen in state after state. That's what happens when you do that. Then people in Kentucky, when they try to close the polling place early, instead of just turning and walking around because people are acting like the suppression doesn't exist, people will stand there and bang on the doors and say, open the doors. And guess what? They open those doors. So when you expose it, when you're honest about it and you tell people that they have power, the exact opposite happens. It motivates people, it mobilizes people, and it increases turnout, the kind of turnout that we've already seen, record turnout in these primaries. And I'm convinced that we'll see record turnout in November if we continue to attack when it's happening and let people know that they have the power. We got power.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to know what you expect to come out of the state Supreme Court hearing of this case tomorrow, and what follow-up you will do after they make whatever decision they make.
Okay, well, first of all, we didn't do this for the court, but the court should have this information, which is why we gave it to the Attorney General, and we're giving it back to the Board of Elections. The important thing here is that now they know this list is bogus, and we're not testing it. It's not a sampling. Again, it's a name by name review. And even though let's say that half of our numbers are wrong, we're still above way above the state's estimate of error, which at 7% they thought was unacceptable. So what's going to happen is, and we don't have on this call right now, but I've also talked to the lawyer that many people consider the #1 voting rights attorney in America, Barbara Arnwine. Professor Columbia University Law School was the head of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And what she said is, look, just what Jeannie has said, our attorney, Jeannie Meyer here, which is that once the commission has this information, by the way, no matter how this court rules on Will's request, which might be, they might pull a jurisdictional thing and say, oh, well, you can't sue the board, you have to sue the counties, which is what Will did in Michigan. But we're saying to the counties, no, you can't remove these people if you get sued by Will, stand steadfast. We're saying to the commission, no matter what, you can't use this list, because now you have the names, name by name, of people who haven't moved, who therefore can't be removed as movers. The list is fatally flawed. And so no matter how the court rules, they can't take away these votes. They can't do it. So we will continue on putting forward this information. And by the way, we'll be going on, go to gregpalast.com and watch out for the follow-up stories in other states they're working on. At the moment, we're looking at Michigan and some others.
Can I just add one thing, Greg?
Yes.
One other thing that we did, I don't believe the state has done this with the ERIC list or the plaintiff. Basically, we called a number of we had to look up their phone numbers. And
700.
Contacts.
700.
We went through 700 names. We got 59 people to answer the phone. And what was the result, Greg?
They said exactly what we thought. Well, actually, we got about 40%.
We're still there. So
yeah,
we
40%,
have
right, 40% as we measured. In fact, it was a little bit higher, the people that responded, than what we found. We got about 40% of our calls saying that they didn't move at all. And most of the rest saying, we just, moved down the street, like Sequana Taylor. And you're not supposed to lose your vote if you move within your municipality. If you stay within Milwaukee City, you don't lose your vote in Milwaukee. And so our calls, and we also sent out ourselves 1,000 large, colorful postcards. If the addresses were wrong, we'd have gotten, we got only a 3.2% back. So, which is what we would expect from our,
Greg, I mean, just that in alone, so what are we saying? That white people don't move? Right? What we're saying, that white people that live in the other tracts, that they don't move? When we know, even in terms of average, in terms of home buyership, there's 7 times, they move 7 times. So if you look at it just on the surface, we need to look at the data, but common sense says that something is awry. In a state like Wisconsin, where you don't have a majority of African Americans, it's not even a highly populated, except in those areas that is concentrated. So why is it that we're seeing it in those concentrated areas, and in our other areas, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, is a duck? It is voter suppression. It is the standard, right, of voter suppression. And they took like a page out of the Southern strategy to really be able to enact this.
Let me just add a technical point for those who've read the report. If you didn't quite get to the section on postcards, one of the reasons for the racial difference, and by the way, is that 5,004 names on this hit list have unmailable addresses, so they wouldn't get that state postcard because they're missing the apartment number on their building. 5,000, and as you know, that's mostly low-income people, and that is substantially African American.
Or young people.
And young people. That, again, those are the two
apartment buildings.
The two groups that are being hit are African Americans and voters of color and young people. But I should also mention, part of the reason for this racial disparity is this use of postcards. Now remember, the the operators understand this difference. The Census Bureau says that if you're a white, older homeowner in the suburbs, you're 600% more likely to return a postcard than a young African American renter in an urban area, because you may not get the postcard. John Lenzer, can you speak to the issue of the racial disparity that occurs when you use like legalistic postcards mailed out? Does that have the racial response difference?
Postcards in general do not get a great response because they're mixed in with other kinds of commercial mail, and they look less important than something larger, and that look less important than you know, a catalog or something like that. And so people go through and they just flip, flip, flip. They give it their mailbox 2 seconds and out goes the piece. And if it's legalistic looking, it's not going to go anywhere. And we believe that very few of the postcards that are mailed by the Secretary of States are actually really looked at carefully, and therefore people don't respond to them.
Yes. Mark, could you talk about the racial aspect of receiving and returning postcards?
So first of all, postcards get a very low response rate to begin with, and it's absolutely ludicrous to use a postcard as proof positive. Failure to return a postcard as proof positive, the final straw that gets you taken off a list. It would be much easier to ask the post office to mail the postcards and send us the ones that are undeliverable, because then you might actually have a good sense that somebody has moved. But on the other hand, a postcard, particularly a legalistic one that requires you to fill out a form and send it back in, automatically skews against people with lower literacy rates. It skews against people who live in apartment buildings, oddly enough, because basically standard mail doesn't get delivered as accurately in apartment buildings as it does, and everybody knows this. You go in and you'll see the same thing thrown on the floor, like, you know, taking nothing away from our great post office. You walk into the foyer of an apartment building in an urban neighborhood, and you will see third-class mail, standard mail, sitting on a pile on the steps, as opposed to an individual post office. If you are a homeowner, which, as Latasha pointed out, is skews to, because of just history and everything, skews more to white people of an older age, then you're more likely to even get the postcard to begin with. And then you get into who responds to a legalistic sort of mailing. And again, it skews against youth. I have a couple of relatively young adult daughters who probably don't know where their mailboxes are. It skews against people of color. It skews against people who have language issues that may not be native English speakers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, thank you. So there's race. I think Cliff said wants to say something.
Yeah, you know, because at the end of the day, this is the fact of the matter is this. Folks who want to reach our community know how to reach our communities. In fact, we have organizations in our community that know how to reach our community. Most of this attack wouldn't even be happening if not for the fact that it's really in opposition to some of the amazing organizing that's been taking work by organizations like Block, organizations like Leaders Igniting Transformation, right? And so the more aggressive and the better we are doing our work, then you start seeing even more of these attacks, right? So at the end of the day, there are folks who know how to reach our community. But this is the issue. The difficulties in reaching our community it's not about putting the burden on or pointing out deficiencies in how we move or how we live or what our addresses are looking like. The burden or the problem is in the fact that you've got a group of people, these right-wing organizations, that they are trying to create a situation where there aren't responses. They are looking for the ways, again, with surgical precision, to try to justify and rationalize these voter purges. In other words, the difficulties and the failures of the bad addresses and all that, it's not accidental. And so we need to make sure we always, and I know that our team, you know, the Greg's team and all of us know this. I just want to make sure that the journalists are clear about this, that the problem doesn't sit within the community and how we live and how our mail works. The problem sits that you've got a group of people, that are intentionally trying to create a situation where they can fraudulently create and manufacture a large list a list that they know is faulty in order to do this voter purge?
I'm in Massachusetts, and 4 years ago in 2016, our elections division participated in interstate cross-check. And I'm hoping that you and others can talk a little bit about how pervasive this sort of purging is nationally, and whether or not states are sharing information as they did when they used interstate cross-check.
Okay, yes. And for those who don't, I'll make it very quick. Interstate cross-check was another purge system created by Chris Kobach of Kansas. And what it did was it purported to find people registered in 2 states. For example, in the state of Georgia, 568 guys named James Brown, and I can't make this up, were removed from the voter rolls of Georgia, all named James Brown, because they found, believe it or not, a James Brown in Detroit and a James Brown in Baltimore and James Brown in Boston. And many of those James Browns around the country, I checked, like in Michigan, that was one of the reasons why Donald Trump took Michigan, was removing voters who they said voted twice. Well, guess what? James Brown, and you can see my latest book actually has copies of the list. So we did this investigation for Al Jazeera and for Rolling Stone magazine and Democracy Now! And Mark Swedlin and John Lenzer did work on this. And we were able to expose it, and it did come to an end. The program is now dead, this cross-check program. Unfortunately, that's why you're seeing groups like Will and others now hunting for the next way to wipe out voters. And this one, so we actually, by exposing it, we defeated cross-check. That system is dead now, can't be used. The state of Kansas is refusing to send lists to others, hit lists to other states. So it does show that this type of action and journalist exposure does make a difference. And that was a campaign, by the way, led by the Reverend Jesse Jackson and Rainbow Push. But now they've got new gimmicks. So they want to take the ERIC list. And by the way, ERIC was not set up as a purge list. It was set up as a way to help get voters, newly moved voters. So they create a movers list, but it's not for the purpose of purging at all. It was originally set up so that, they send a postcard to Jose Garcia. If it's the wrong Jose Garcia, it doesn't matter, because all you do is you ask him to register. And that's what your Wisconsin Election Board did. Welcome to Wisconsin. We think that you've just moved here. You've moved, re-register or register. So they're abusing the will list, because they got 30 states that use that use ERIC list. Now, half of those states use it correctly to add voters to the voter rolls. But a few of those states are picking up this idea from Will that you use a welcome letter, believe it or not, to welcome new mover, new person to Wisconsin, and using that to remove people's right to vote. So it's the new gimmick, and we have to, again, so exposure stopped interstate cross-check. Hopefully exposure will stop the misuse of ERIC. In Georgia, it was a different system called use it or lose it. If people didn't vote for a couple elections, then they missed that postcard, that crappy little postcard, junk mail, as people see it that way. So it's another way to remove people. But so we have to keep exposing through journalistic means. And of course, David, through then that's why groups like ACLU and Latasha Brown and other groups, the Rainbow Push, go to court, but mainly make this a public issue. And the biggest thing we want people to do is check your registration right now. Most states close off registration next week. Check your registration.
So one, they can also go to our website, www.blackvotersmatterfund.org/vote, and check their status. I do want to just to quickly say what Greg has raised. What we know is that since 2014, 33 million people have been dropped from the voting rolls. Now, so of course, we know some of them have died through attrition and other pieces, but when you look at, you factor this in, it's like death of 1,000 cuts. If you shave off 1,000 here, 10,000 here, 3,000 here, whether it's through exact match, whether it's through the cross-check, whether it's through these different methods, it is all a concerted effort, right, to make sure that we're dropping the majority of particularly communities of color from the voting rolls. In addition to that, when you look at, let's go to Michigan, which is a swing and a critical state in this last election, Trump won election by 10,700 votes. We know there were over 70,000 votes, and Greg talks about in his book that was literally thrown out that were never counted. Well, we can go around the country and show that there is a concerted effort. This is not isolated. And some levels, it's not just, we can even look at when we're talking about the legal strategy. We know that the Republicans, the Republican Party actually doubled their money that they were going to put for legal strategy to even challenge groups challenge these efforts to expand access to the ballot. In Houston, they're suing Texas. There are legislators in Texas right now in Houston. They have 24-hour voting sites. They're suing to shut that down. And so anytime, regardless, that we're seeing folks that not only is the voter purges, it's not only the closing of polling sites, it's not only just the voter ID, but we also see that even when there are efforts of states to expand access in the midst of the largest health pandemic we've had in this country in the last 100 years, that you have actors, you have a party that's actually voting to suppress, to prevent people to have access to the ballot.
Hi, has Eric had anything to say about your revelations? I did speak to the founder of Eric, David Becker, when I was covering this story for Rolling Stone magazine. And he told me that, again, this is, there's no fraud here. This is, again, supposed to be a welcoming letter. The whole point of Eric, which was originally, by the way, set up by the Pew Trust, which was to increase voter registration. So this would be definitely an abuse. Now, what about Eric itself? I got to tell you, it's now been spun off from Pew. They should stop mentioning Pew. It's now controlled mostly by GOP voting officials, are in the majority. And again, this is not a partisan question. This is just a factual question. The GOP is taking control of it and we need to turn it around into a purge operation. We have been unable to reach Eric for their response. And when I say unable, while we've literally, my producers and others have made calls, I have literally 20 calls to their offices, to their members. We can't get a response out of Eric about what the hell they are up to, and are they noticing the abuse of their system in Wisconsin that is proposed by Will. So if there are no other questions, any other questions? I want to thank Latasha Brown and Cliff Albright, the co-founders of Black Voters Matter Fund. Jeannie Meyer, our national attorney, Mark Swedland and John Lenzer, two of our terrific experts. And to all of you who have participated, if you have any further questions, you can always reach Latasha Brown or Cliff Albright at the Black Voters Matter Fund through their site. And you can always go to gregpalast.com, download the full report, watch the film, whatever you need. Thank you, and thank you, everyone. Bye.